Hi, this is Carl Levan, and welcome to Rights, Reason, and Representation. I'm here with Patricia Schwertel, and she just wrote an essay, a co-authored essay in the Journal of Controversial Ideas called In Defense of Merit in Science. Dr. Schwertel is affiliated with Doctors Without Borders. She has a PhD from University of Heidelberg and is also affiliated with Monash University as an adjunct researcher in nursing and affiliated medical sciences. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about her essay called In Defense of Merit in Science. And the first thing I want to start with is just to ask Dr. Schwertel what she means by epistemology. And the essay talks about liberal epistemology in particular. So what do you mean by epistemology? And thanks so much for having this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. So it's about what knowledge is and how we acquire knowledge. And liberal epistemology is a way of thinking about knowledge that really values openness and viewpoint diversity, tolerance, critical thinking. Yeah, that's probably the best way I can describe it.
Okay, so liberal epistemologies might be where the tradition of peer review comes from, for example.
Yeah, and I suppose a good visual of this is a big funnel. And all of the ideas are welcome at the big part of the funnel. Other people describe this as the marketplace of ideas. So all diverse, you know, blue sky thinking, crazy ideas are welcome in the funnel, but then they're interrogated as they go down. And theoretically, only the best ideas come out at the narrow end of the funnel.
So this sounds a little bit like John Stuart Mill.
Yes,
Right.
I borrow from him.
Right.
As many people do, talking about philosophical liberalism and liberal science.
And one of the things that you talk about in that essay with your co-authors is positionality statements. And I recently reviewed a book for Perspectives on Politics, which is a big political science journal. And the book concluded with a long positionality statement. And so I'm hoping for people who are listening, if you could explain a little bit about what a positionality statement is and why that might be in tension with the type of epistemology that you just described.
Yeah, sure. So positionality statements or reflexivity statements have gained a lot of momentum in recent years. They're based on the practice of reflexivity, so it's probably, or positionality, so it's probably useful to separate the practice of reflexivity from reflexivity statements or positionality statements, because reflexivity is something that is a practice that qualitative researchers routinely engage in, but any researchers engage in, where they really reflect on their identity, their background, their political beliefs, and how they influence the research questions that they ask, the way they engage in the research process, how they analyze and interpret their findings. And I'm a big fan of that process. I think it's really necessary. And as human beings, we tend to be self-reflective as well and consider our biases. But when you simplify that and put it into a reflexivity statement, it doesn't really have the same effect. And there's a certain amount of problems that arise in practice. So it's one of those situations, I think, where something's good in theory, but maybe not good in practice and can actually be counterproductive to the goal. So the ways I think positionality statements are in tension with liberal epistemology is the emphasis on subjectivity. So and the emphasis on identity, whereas in liberal epistemology you really focus on the sole merit of the idea, and liberal epistemology is about believing that or valuing objectivity and striving for that objectivity. So positionality statements can introduce like an overemphasis on subjectivity that can undermine or compromise that striving for objectivity.
Or the perception of being fair to different views and these other things that we value in liberal epistemology, I suppose.
That's right, yeah, and the emphasis on the researcher rather than the idea and the identity of that researcher. And I suppose another good way to talk about, or an example of how it can undermine the process is, I had a PhD student who recently asked for a checklist for a reflexivity statement because they were asked to submit one and didn't really critically think about, is it as simple as a checklist and what do you put on that checklist? And also another colleague who submitted an article to a journal and was asked during the peer review process, asked by a reviewer about their identity and whether they thought it was appropriate for them to be studying that particular topic. So it introduces all of these different problems in the social process that's around generating and acquiring knowledge.
Yeah, thank you. And the essay also talks about critical social justice compared to social justice. And, this reminded me of a couple of years ago when in American politics, some activists on the right started using the shorthand of social justice warrior, or SJW, in memes online and so forth to criticize the left. But the distinction between critical social justice and social justice seems important. So what's the line of distinction there?
Yeah, I think it's an important line to draw, and it does create quite a bit of confusion. So I think it's important to lay that out. Also because it's kind of been labelled as a new form of social justice, and so it borrows from the historical wins, I suppose, and the success of liberal social justice itself, whereas it's based on really different philosophical assumptions. So probably the best way to describe it is that liberal social justice really focuses on individual rights and liberties, whereas critical social justice is really emphasizing your belonging to certain groups. So that's a key difference. I find in practice, liberal social justice, which is based on, probably the best quote to evoke it is Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream," that people are evaluated on their merit rather than their identities. The other kind of culture of liberal social justice is that acknowledges progress and strives for further progress and advocates for incremental reform, whereas critical social justice tends to be radically skeptical of progress and at its extreme denies it. And then logically following on from that, there's kind of, rather than advocating for reform, there's a tendency to advocate for radical change and even dismantling institutions, different types of agreements. And I think liberal social justice, like liberal epistemology, is really open for debate and encourages open debate, constructive dissent, viewpoint diversity, whereas critical social justice is based on a number of tenets that have to be accepted from the outset. In that way, it has a tendency, and I'm talking about the extreme form of it, to be quite illiberal and to be intolerant of debate.
Thank you. That's a powerful distinction. And yet there are a lot of social institutions that we want to dismantle, different types of hierarchies and racism and so forth. But I think a premise of the essay is that this can be accomplished without the attachment to subjectivity.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I agree with that.
So the essay in Journal of Controversial Ideas also opens with a brief and compelling summary of major scientific accomplishments. For example, the revolution in agriculture, cutting child mortality in half globally. And this reminded me a lot of Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, where just chapter after chapter, he argues that there have been these huge leaps in human progress over the last 1 or 2 centuries, And when you look at just basic mortality and access to food and things along those lines, it's really compelling. But the essay also briefly and importantly acknowledges the persistence of inequalities. So, what's the best way to address them?
The best way to address inequalities, coming from a liberal perspective, is to focus on the key principles of equal opportunity, universalism, and this is kind of played out in legal reforms and policies that are based on those principles. So, for example, anti-discrimination laws that are applied consistently and not in an effort to advantage certain groups that are perceived to be, perhaps not by everyone, as somehow disadvantaged. So I suppose the way to address those inequalities, and yeah, I mean, Steve, that's a great book by Steven Pinker, I suppose, and I agree with a lot that's in it, and it's very much based on empirical facts. But I suppose, and there is some acknowledgement that those benefits haven't been shared equally amongst all groups. And one example of that would be the hunger example for that the statistics have been kind of conflated by the rise of China, and the benefits in child mortality and reducing hunger haven't been felt as equally in Africa and parts of Asia.
Yeah.
But I digress a bit from answering your question. I suppose addressing those inequalities is best approached, I think, by focusing on equal opportunity and not equal outcome. And you have to choose between one of those, I would argue, but we can debate that if you like.
Yeah, I mean, it might be valuable to debate that, but I think one of the things that we lose when we drift away from universal rights or rights framed in universal terms is the principle of fairness, that it becomes harder and harder to uphold a standard of fairness if the access to justice or access to resources is based on some sort of categorical identification.
Yes. So the idea of fairness, I suppose, from a liberal perspective, would be making sure that opportunities and privileges are accessible to everyone, regardless of their identity.
So this makes me think a little bit about ethics, and the essay in Journal of Controversial Ideas also notes that science is, quote, but a tool that can be used for good or bad. It is our responsibility as a society to use it responsibly, ethically, effectively, unquote. And this, of course, made me think of Robert Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb. And he was substantially motivated by the project just to see if it could be done. And it's always been sort of interesting to me that he got in trouble when he started wondering whether it should have been done. And what he was missing was sort of that ethical compass. And so, all across the Western world, religion, an obvious source of ethics, has been on the decline. Pippa Norris and a number of scholars in my field have been writing about this phenomenon. So what might guide an ethics of science, or sort of how do we decide which questions are worth answering?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I suppose ethically in science, we could argue that the pursuit of truth is a noble endeavour in and of itself. And in that way, we're doing humanity a favour by seeking truth. Or at least if we don't want to argue that, we could at least concede that it's better than what came before that, which was pretty much the whims of a king, or what we perceive to be God's will, which predated the Enlightenment. So what sort of ethics should science be based on? I mean, I think that's a really good example with Oppenheimer as well, because you could argue that it was corrupted from the start. There was like a partnership between the military, the politics, and the science from the very beginning with a specific goal in mind. Whereas Oppenheimer really embodied, what you would hope for a true scientist to have the freedom, that academic freedom of being curious and wanting to see if something was possible. And that's why, and I'm sure you talk about this a lot in your work, and my background isn't political science, but why that separation between science and politics is so important. And so it was kind of failed from the start, or corrupt from the start, because of the nature of that process. So what should guide the questions that we ask? I mean, I think it is also important for scientists to think about the potential consequences of their work, but perhaps not at the detriment of uncovering the truth. And I think that's a difficult line to draw. But science is based on ethical principles, and they're very similar, because my background is in the medical faculty, the ethical principles of medicine. So beneficence and non-maleficence. So science should benefit society, and those so we should maximize the benefits and reduce the risks. And the principle of justice, that the benefits of those of the scientific findings should benefit groups as much as possible, and there should be ideally a fair distribution of those benefits to society.
Thank you. And students in my undergraduate course, Post-Truth America, encounter your essay on merit after reading Michael Sandel's excerpts from Michael Sandel's book, which critiques merit. And you and your co-authors propose that we can evaluate merit in two ways: by looking at the strength of the evidence and the importance of the finding. And I'm wondering if this leaves out recognition, which is really a central goal, I think, of Critical Theory's project. That is, those who contribute to knowledge and knowledge production sometimes don't get credit because of their social status or marginality. So can merit really address some of those concerns about recognition?
Yeah, that's a good point. And Sandel makes some good points as well about the limitations of merit. But I suppose I see a recognition of the limitations of merit as an opportunity to improve meritocratic systems, and not as a reason to dismantle them. Because, and which is kind of the way that critical theory thinks, or critical social justice thinks, that there's kind of this frustration with a lack of perfection or a lack of progress, because the underlying philosophical assumptions is there is no progress. And so this frustration leads to kind of a will to dismantle merit, whereas it is a tool of upward mobility. So, and I often find this in these kind of critical essays, that they tend to problematize, but not really offer an alternative. And again, my background's not political science, but I think it was a quote by Winston Churchill that capitalism is the best of the worst political systems. And I suppose you could argue that merit is the best of the worst systems to strive for fairness and equity. And we haven't found a better system. So I do think we need to focus on the critiques that Sandel makes and others to increase, to strengthen it as one tool of upward mobility, not the only one.
And also that perhaps merit is not the only principle at work in scientific pursuit. A lot of your work has explored climate change as well, and this makes me think about a different type of question in relation to subjectivity, which is, couldn't one argue that the diversity of identities, the diversity generated by different lived experiences, helps generate good research questions? So for example, I might go to the Niger Delta expecting to study the environmental impact of gas flaring or something along those lines. And then the ethnic minority groups like the Ogonis might say, well, what you really need to be looking at is the oil spills, because that's maybe been more central to their lived experience and to the broader set of things I'm interested in. So, could you talk a little bit about that relationship between sort of lived experience and generating or missing good research questions?
Yeah, that's a good issue to bring up. I think lived experience has gained popularity as a term in the past decade, maybe, and much more recently as well. So I think we need to be really specific about what we mean by lived experience, because it can mean a lot of things. Anything from the true experiential knowledge generated from a community or a society or a population to an anecdote from one person. So we need to be careful about how we use that term, I think. In terms of choosing research questions, I think there are lots of ethical principles and guidelines for good conduct of research that encompass these types of considerations. And there's definitely been a rise in community participation, in consultation and needs analysis, so that the questions that we ask actually address the problems and the priorities of the people who stand to benefit from that research. And this is a big area of concern at the moment in my area of research, which is global health and climate change. But I think that the best insights and policies arise from the combination of propositional knowledge that can be acquired and experiential knowledge. So you often find that if you have research groups that take that into consideration. For example, in health science, we have representatives who represent patients, for example, on certain decision-making or research bodies or randomized control trial groups that guide that type of research. So yeah, I think that this combination between propositional and experiential knowledge is really important and generates the best insights for science and practice.
Thanks so much. Last question. What would you say to the young, smart person who believes in merit or wants to believe in merit, but faces a lot of adversity?
Yeah, I'd probably say go back to first principles and really understand the underlying assumptions and principles for what you're arguing for. And when it comes to merit, it is philosophical liberalism and liberal epistemology. And I think sometimes people argue certain policies or points of view without really fully understanding what the principles are or the basic assumptions that underlie those arguments. And also, I suppose, like borrowing from the principles of liberal epistemology, just to be open-minded, to really listen to whoever's advocating for something different, and to understand their point of view fully. And also, I suppose, always consider that you could be wrong, and be open to that possibility as well.
All right. Thanks so much, Dr. Schwertel, co-author of the essay In Defense of Merit in Journal of Controversial Ideas.
And thank you.